Before I went for my master's, actually, I was in Southern Sudan, which was not a country yet. The Ugandan government and the rebels were having peace talks, and often I was the only woman journalist in that room, full of government soldiers and rebels representatives. We were staying in tents, literally by the River Nile at that point, and attending the peace talks, and mostly everyone is a man. So you rely on your male journalist friends to really protect you, literally, because this was a hostile situation. For example, I had one of the peace negotiators, I wanted an interview with him, and he asked me to go to his hotel room. I quickly understood. I say, wow, he was talking to all the men and giving them all the bites and everything. And for me, he wanted me to go to his hotel. I quickly thought about it and asked one of the male journalists to escort me at that time. And he was kind of shocked that I came with another journalist.
Imagine a world where we have gender equality and equity in and through the media. That is our mission at African Women in Media. I am Dr. Yemisi Akimbobola, your host, and this is Her Media Diary, a podcast that captures the lived experiences of African women working in media industries. In this episode, I'm joined by Rosebell Kagumire, a trained journalist, rights advocate, digital strategist, public speaker, and award-winning blogger with expertise in human rights, gender, peace, and conflict issues. Rosebell recounts the challenges and dangers she faced as a young female journalist reporting from the front line in South Sudan. These experiences exposed her to the harsh realities of war and the unique struggles faced by women in conflict situations, and it ignites her passion for advocating for women's rights and African feminism. Throughout this series, we will be in conversation with African women who have covered or are covering conflict situations to share their lived experiences. By inviting these voices into conversation, we hope to provide solutions to break down barriers faced by African women in media industries. So thanks for doing the interview, Rose. But I don't know whether you've listened to previous episodes, but we always like to start with kind of trying to get to know the person first and the history and. So where did you grow up, Rosebell?
Oh, I grew up in a village in Uganda, southwestern Uganda, a place called Bushenyi.
Okay.
And I stayed there for 18 years and studied from southwest of Uganda for those years before going to Kampala for my university.
Okay, so you grew up for quite a while in the village in Uganda. What was that like for you? Taking you back memory lane.
Yeah, just like most people, most of Ugandans, they say you're not from Kampala, we are from somewhere. So unless my generation, you're never born like in the city. Those are very few people. So we are all from a village. So it was lovely experience. I still go there. I still have my family there. I spend a lot of time there when I'm not traveling. It was a lovely childhood, freedom. When I think of like even where my spirit wants to be, that's what I imagine. Because as a child, you were free to roam around, dance, play, living in a community where you're not afraid of going to a neighbor's place. You know all your neighbors, first of all. By the age of 7, so many households, and you do similar things with everybody. So for me, it's always been that kind of experience that grounds me in the understanding of community and what community is about. That's what I love, and that's the kind of place I grew up.
Yeah.
Very, very peaceful, green, rolling hills, beautiful. Still to this day, amazing. Yeah.
Yeah, it sounds wonderful. What's your fondest memories of those early years?
Well, my fondest memories is really to sit after dinner or even before with my grandfather and my grandmother and they loved me a lot. I think for me, when I think of love, the earliest memories of actually people who loved me were my grandparents. They were very fond of me. I've always been a very, very interesting, curious child. So
Yeah.
I was always surrounded by adults asking for me to do this, teaching me this and that. And those are the memories, like evening hours after dinner. My grandmother is telling me stories, teaching me different things, and my grandfather too would be teaching me, both of them. So those are my really good memories.
Yeah. No, we have a lot in common in terms of that because I was very close to my maternal grandparents.
Yeah.
And miss them dearly. And one of the things I always wish I did was to ask them more questions, like know more about their own childhood, their own growing up and stuff.
Yeah.
So tell me more about kind of the influence that they had on you and, what it was like for you in that village environment also growing up.
For me, both my paternal and maternal grandparents, they came from the same village, actually. My parents are neighbors, literally.
Okay.
So I grew up with both families, and they all loved a lot of education, my paternal grandfather never really studied that much higher, but he was very respected, had earned, worked so hard, used to, fight for school land from people who wanted to grab it. And he was very invested in, like, education. And when at the time when people were saying like a girl cannot go to school,
Mm.
he was changing these narratives. And on my maternal side, my grandfather was a teacher. He was well educated and he had five daughters. All of them he took to school. So
Yeah.
for me, those are very good foundations. And my grandmothers, both of them, even if they were not actually educated, like they didn't really go to school, they supported their children to have an education. And I think one of the most hilarious stories is them telling us their experience of attempt at adult education. It was very difficult, and they were annoyed with the whole situation of adult education.
Okay.
But actually, they attended classes. Like there were some initiatives they tried to attend adult education, but even when they could, they were not in school, they really supported their children to have an education. They were hardworking. Yeah, like everyone was supportive for me. To from my mother's time, my mother went to school, her sisters went to school. On my dad's side, people went to school. So it was always that understanding that I'm going to go to school. I don't have a memory of assuming like what am I, as a child, like what I'm supposed to do. School was always the place I was going to go, and not any other expectation. Expectation was go to school, excel, and do your thing. So for me,
Mm.
those are very, very important foundations. And especially I say this because not everybody in the village was like that, absolutely. So I was very privileged that even when I lived in the village, I had generations of people who had gone to school. And I never doubted what education should mean to me. And I never, as many people contended with these questions, many young women, many young girls, whether really they belong to school or they belong in any space, I have never had to contend with this kind of feeling where I belong and where I don't belong.
So what was your experience like then back then in terms of being in education in school? What was your schooling experience like?
Actually, for the first 6 years of my education, I went to a village school near my home. We
Yeah.
would run to school like within 10 minutes. You run and you're in class, literally. We wake up, you do home chores, you fetch water, we fetched water from the well. You leave the basics, you wash dishes from the previous night. You leave everything very ready so that whoever is taking care after you go to school, that does not start from scratch, then you just run to school. And for me, school was great because most of them, my teachers were from the nearby, communities when you were there from. And it was always nice to see, it's someone familiar also. It's not someone, there's not this abstract idea of a teacher. A
Mm.
teacher is still a community person, part of the community. And that instilled a bit of different grounding, your respect for a teacher, but also not this kind of distance from them, right?
Mm.
So I remember that in the very humble school, but it was still doing really great. And
Mm.
I studied there for 6 years on my primary education before I transferred to the district school, where in the district where my mom worked at the time.
And so, where did your interest in women's rights, African feminism, journalism, all of that, where did that all first emerge?
It's very difficult to really pinpoint a place. I think that you kind of like, as you grow, you gravitate towards things that what you think your purpose is and where you think you can be most useful as a person. But I've always been, let's say, as a child, like I say, I used to perform for my family members. I'm the kid who'd be dancing, singing, acting, doing a play. So I've always been an expressive person. I express myself. I'm not afraid of being, audience, seeking audience. So, and the environment I grew up in allowed me to be that. And for me, I think that that is the biggest foundation for you to speak, because you cannot really speak on key issues if you have not easily, you have to go back to like, where's my voice? Right? Yeah, for me, voice has always been very integral of my childhood and everything. There's no point in my life I felt like, I can't have my voice,
Yeah.
So for me, this is everything and every work, whether it's women's rights, whether it's media that I've worked in, it goes back to voice. When you think of like, as a child, did you have a voice? Did people allow you to space to be? So for me, it comes from that, kind, but also like growing up then later, like in your teenage year, you're also aware as you grow up of the privilege you have. Like you're not excessive privilege because I'm not from a wealthy family, but still privilege has different layers. If your
Absolutely.
parents are educated, you're more likely to be aware of so many things. And if your extended family is educated, you already have like a bit of idea of what you want or you think so. But it's a luxury to have in many conditions in African countries, especially for a girl to have that space to imagine what they want to be, even at the earliest stage, and really try to work towards it. So for me, it comes back to voice, your own voice. And as I grow up, I realized that privileges, what's happening. I was very much interested in women's rights because I went to university on a government scholarship. My parents were very relieved because they had a few other kids in school and they wouldn't afford like a top university like Makerere University in Uganda. So for me, I had to work extra hard to get into a government scholarship. But actually, the course I wanted to take was journalism. And if there was no like any intervention, I was missing it by like zero point 0.5
Oh
thereabout,
gosh.
right? But because Uganda actually parliamentarians earlier, women's rights groups had pushed to have this, is it 1.5? If I remember well, for girls to really increase girls' intake in universities because it was still really, really low.
No, yeah.
Higher education was still very male. So I actually got to university because I earned that point because of women's rights groups and saying that to get the kind of course I wanted and had dreamed to do. So for me, I become more and more aware as I get to university of like, why this is very important, what does this mean? It's very significant. So I think to have a voice to speak on issues, it comes from deep reflection of your own experience and why you think your experience connects to others and where it matters. So for me, it comes from all these experiences. And it's not to say like, my entire childhood or something was a blissful experience, but of course, you stay in the same country where there's wars going on, there's coups happening. As a child, we lived through that. You're aware there's a war going on in a different part of the country. You consume this information, and as you become an adult, you try to understand why this, why that. So for me, the interest came from really seeking to understand, okay, I'm part of this country, and I come from this place, but the world starts becoming bigger from your small village to now a city. You're getting in a university. You learn, you get different experiences, and you learn your own privilege, but also your own disadvantages in this whole. And then you learn to, when you speak up for yourself, how do you speak up for others? I think it's something you acquire along the way, but you always have like a foundation.
Yeah, very important point. And I'm curious to know that transition from going from the village to the university in the city. What was that like for you? Like when you take yourself back to that moment?
It's quite a shocker because nobody prepares you for that, you know. I think I'd been only to Kampala only once for a holiday when my uncle told me, "Oh, you need to come and see Kampala." Just he was kind enough. And of course, even in the holiday as a teenager, you were just in an enclosed place, right? So it's not like I saw it. So I didn't have a good idea of what it's worth. And it's very, very scary. And in Uganda, most of us go to boarding school, right? Most schools that are better performing, this is inherited from colonial times. There are no public schools that are day school. There are few, which are great, which are public schools and accessible. So most schools that you want to go and get a good education are actually boarding school. So that means that as a teenager, this really cuts you off a lot from the reality of, while you are a kid and you're free and all this, as you're an adolescent and that, you're really in a very closed environment. And these are like 4 years of your life, 5 years of your life. 4 to 6 years of your life, you're in a very neatly closed environment. And I went to an all-girls school. So suddenly you are out in the world. You're like 17 and everybody speaks you to the world. Figure it out. You need to do this. Suddenly you're an adult. Things are expected of you. It was very, very difficult because even if, for example, I was on a government scholarship, it was hard to get upkeep. Sometimes even if you're a government scholarship, you have certain meals, but really horrible meals. So you really have to depend on your relatives, family to really send you some little money. So it was a struggle to come from you've been at least eating well. I think in secondary school where I was, it was really good in that way in terms of nutrition and stuff. And suddenly you're struggling. You're becoming an adult. You're also struggling with basic things like nutrition and getting the food. It's just shaking because my entire life I never had to struggle to think of food. Because if you live in a village, food is there. There's a plantation here. Everything is plenty, especially in Uganda. Like it's really like food is everywhere. But suddenly you're in a city where money to get everything is money. And your parents don't really have this kind of money. So it's a struggle. So for me, in terms of financial, all these finances and day-to-day living, basic living, actually becomes a struggle. It's like a rude awakening to like what adulthood is going to be, So that is really hard. And to, of course, navigate city life and being alone, being independent as a human being for the first time. It's an extremely fragile time and many things can go wrong,
Yeah. And so did you end up studying journalism in
I
university?
did study at Makerere University, mass communication, which includes journalism, public relations, international relations, economics. It's a lot at the undergraduate level. So then, before I actually then finished my university, like in my second year, I went to do an internship at the Daily Monitor, which is one of the leading newspapers in the country, and I never looked back. I've always, in fact, I studied more. I did less studies. I did more work and more being at work. It was very worrying. Yes, my parents were not sure I was going to pass university. but most of my time, and again, it came from, I think, a bit of discontent. Like the things, I was now in a newsroom and I could see daily realities of what journalism is about. And then sometimes you go back to school and you see the kind of education being offered has loopholes,
And
right?
there's a disconnect, right, between the education
Yes.
and the practice. Yeah.
Absolutely, a big disconnect. So even if this is the best university in Uganda, like there is so much disconnect, problems plaguing the university, of course, lecturers not being paid, so many strikes. And this is like your introduction to struggle, really, to understand, like, how everything affects you. But at the same time, like I was already in a newsroom at the age of 19 and I'm taking on, small assignments and understanding different perspectives really and understanding the country, like what really is this system, before you always think, oh, this is happening, but really to understand who are the forces behind this and that. It was very incredible for me to open my eyes and for people to open for me, because actually I had an uncle in the same newsroom. And it was very, it was very privileged for me to actually get the placement and actually perform and stay there and get my place in the in the newsroom and stay after my university to work there. Yeah.
So, what would you say having that opportunity to be in that active newsroom whilst in your education, what would you say that did for you in terms of now when you then finished your education and began to flourish? What was the impact for you?
I think it quickly introduced me to the dynamics of, society, not just the newsroom, but what is what in society. Because as a journalist, you are a very privileged person, actually. Because on a daily basis, you interact with so many layers of society. You could be sent to a market to talk to traders. You could be sent to the presidential briefing. So you're able to transit through society and see it for what it is, right? And for me, I think that is very, very, very privileged access. That very few people, I think very few professions
Mm.
manage to teach anybody like that in real life, to be able to really look at what everybody, different aspects of society are doing, whether they are in harmony or how they affect each other, to watch that. And it gives you a good foundation of like questioning and learning. And I always wanted to learn. So for me, it was very, very, it was like I'm in school, to be honest. Like for me, the newsroom was the school, actually, in many times. So it's built to me, for me, that big foundation. And in Uganda, that we still had the war going on in north and northeastern, a whole chunk of part of Uganda
Yeah.
was in war. The war only ended in 2009, thereabout. But my whole like childhood, that part of the country was mostly in war, right? And I come from a country where there had never been war. So for me, then I start seeing the questions that linger for a country, not for a society, how differences, what informs that one person grows up in a part that is really under conflict and massive displacement. And you're actually the same country living peacefully, like I've explained, my childhood being very, very happy childhood and having no more problems of, outside the conflict, like your family struggling with money to take you to school. That was a normal problem. While the kids in another part of the country were running for their life, losing their life, being kidnapped, all this for me, journalism then exposed me that I was no longer just a reader. I was actually on the inside, seeing people covering this war and understanding what it means. And I think early on, I was able to go to the north of the country. And it was, for me, some of the most moving experiences was the fact that there were girls younger than me. I've just finished my university, or still in university, maybe around 20. These kids are like 14 years old, carrying babies from rape. It was my first time, like, to,
Witness that. Yeah.
witness that. It was just like heartbreaking. I remember literally being a 20-year-old, being in my hotel room and crying in the night, like, because I didn't prepare, like, nothing would prepare me for this kind of mass suffering and violence on such a scale that I'd never seen. So for me, these kind of assignments really earlier on showed me that even if like the war was going on, girls were having a way different experience of war than anybody else, the other people. So understanding these differences and how, and putting myself like, okay, these are people my age, some of them were younger than me. My life could be this. So
Mm.
seeing that privilege and also asking yourself why their life has become like that, why an alternative is not being put forward. So for me, these early assignments open my eyes in terms of power and who's at the bottom of power, who's at the top of power, geographically, gender-wise, all these questions that we still contend with today. It was my early, like, really exposure to these kind of stories, to cover these kind of stories, that opened my eyes.
I want to go back to that 20-year-old Rosebell in the hotel room after witnessing that. And, as you were talking, I was just thinking, well, what should the newsroom have done to prepare you for that? How did you kind of go through that mentally and resolve that with yourself? What was your experience beyond after that?
I don't think anybody was being prepared, because I think that even the journalists that had come before me, because this was towards the end of the war, actually,
Yeah.
had actually been on the front lines and had seen really gruesome atrocities. And there was this whole idea that you're a journalist, you're covering this, and there was really no debriefing about you what happened
Mm.
to you. Never existed, right? Never. Not for anybody else that had gone covered that war and any other, massacres that the country had witnessed, right? So really, yeah, you really had to find your own way of like channeling these kind of conflicting feelings of like, whoa, like you live a privilege, like this is what other people are living, but this is your job, then what do you do about it, right?
Mm.
And I continued, not only when I left Daily Monitor, I worked briefly for several other outlets, and I still continue to cover like the post-conflict recovery
Mm.
in northern Uganda, and still seeing the persistent issues. And I became more really interested, of course, in what women's war experiences were like, and really bringing that out, because remember that the majority of people covering this war are men. Yes, they can say this is what women went through, but there is a certain layer of access and story and reflection that it takes a certain positionality for you to say, whoa, like, we need to learn this more, to understand this more, to keep this on the forefront, right? So for me, those were really life changing, and finding ways to, I wasn't covering this constantly, so that helped a lot, but I would take several trips to different parts to write about what was going on.
And of course, all of these things that you're saying about women's experiences, particular experiences during conflict, is why we have mechanisms like Women, Peace and Security Agenda and the National Action Plans, etc. I mean, I've researched this, and what I find interesting is that not many national action plans consider the experiences of women journalists in these spaces as well, right? Which speaks to kind of what you're saying also in terms of your experience as that young girl. And obviously, you've subsequently gone to hearing your experience really resonates with me, and the importance of one for the newsrooms to really consider this, but also for it to be part of national action plans regarding the WPS.
Yes.
And so I know you went on to do a master's in media peace and conflict studies, and you've contributed to the Institute for War and Peace Reporting. And obviously, like you said, worked with other broadcasters, so Ugandan Radio Network, NTV, Uganda, and all that. So how did your kind of your area and your niche become to emerge, through all of these experiences?
Yeah, I think it was from that early experience with the Daily Monitor and going to northern Uganda and being sparked, and really that left in me that I needed to continue to understand the aspects of war that are affecting women and people on the margins. Like really, there is the marginalized, and there's the really, really people on the very periphery of this everything. So before I went for my master's, actually, at that point, the war and the end of war progressed, and I actually was in Southern Sudan, which was not a country yet.
Mm.
Before South Sudan became a country, I was in Sudan, in Southern Sudan, where the Ugandan government and the rebels were having peace talks, and often I was the only woman journalist in that room, and a room full of government soldiers and rebels representatives. To be honest, again, no one prepared me for this, right?
Mm.
They see you, you're a young woman who knows politics, who's interested in politics. You have the gut for it. This is what they see. And unfortunately, our newsrooms were not, well equipped to prepare you. Like I was going in the middle of nowhere in this case. It
Mm.
was Juba was not a city. It was like a
Mm.
village, small little tents. We were staying in tents, literally by the River Nile at that point, and attending the peace talks, and often staying for like 3 weeks in the peace talks, right? And mostly everyone is a man. So you rely on your male journalist friends to really protect you, literally, because this was a hostile situation. For example, I had one of the peace negotiators, I wanted an interview with him, one of the delegations, and he asked me to go to his hotel room. I was staying with journalists. So I quickly understood. I say, whoa, why he was talking to all the men and giving them all the bites and everything. And for me, he wanted me to go to his hotel.
Go to your hotel room,
So
right?
I quickly thought about it and asked one of the male journalists to escort me at that time. I said, let's go together, and he was kind of shocked that I came with with another journalist. And you can tell, you know what I mean? As women, this kind of aggression, microaggression men do in any situation where they think they have an upper hand, you can tell what his intention is, to put you in a certain situation of compromise, a certain situation of like coercion that no one will even believe it, right? So these kinds of experience for me, I was seeing that every day, and including like you're in a room full of men and you are aware they're all looking at you, like in a very, this kind of violence is very difficult to explain to somebody, but being really aware of it and finding like your employer is not really working with you on this. You're not even telling, it's not something, it's a sexual violence is not something we even talk about ourselves, right? You can actually go as a journalist talking about women's experiences of violence, but if it's happening to you, then you can't easily talk about it. And the employer is not really rating you for this kind of like, you're going out, it's going to be in a very remote place, you're going to stay 3 weeks among men, how you should actually protect yourself, who can you, what are the numbers? I think back, like I was like, this was crazy. This was crazy. I was relying on my relationships with the Uganda government military, right? Because it was there. At least I can, with the military, you know that whatever happened, you could try to push back because there's an audience back home. But at the same time, it wasn't like there are rules, right? Where you are. And at the same time, a very peculiar experience. So in the evening, of course, you're finished. It's a very remote place. There are few hotels and emerging small bars within hotel rooms. So as journalists, you go after work, you're hanging out with your friends, debriefing, having a drink here and there to just kind of relax, right? Take a rest. So I remember, again, a very peculiar experience there, a man coming to talk to me. It's a man, a Sudanese man. And I'm like, blocking. And my friend really saved me. He told me, oh, you do not say no to Sudanese men.
Wow.
You have to entertain the conversation.
Okay.
Yes. You have to entertain the conversation and let him down gently.
Whoa.
Like someone had to whisper that in my ear. I say, so what happens? Like everybody here is almost armed. Do you realize? And like again, it was a bar situation within a hotel that is guarded, right? So I did not like think about that. I'm like, okay. And these are social situations where you are still a female journalist in a conflict situation that you remember about masculinity, the dangers of you as a woman, as a female journalist. And sometimes are not that different from the women who are facing the brutalities of war. So it's just like you have more power, maybe understanding of how to navigate. You could call a friend, you could call this, but actually the way the society is designed to debase women, it doesn't free you, even if you're a journalist. Your class, your position as a journalist does not protect you often from this kind of thing. So you have to learn to kind of navigate them. So for me, working in that area, I saw that both from people who are on the official, being international media, the very people you interview being the people sexually harassing you, plus an ordinary man you just saw in a bar, and someone warning you that he could be armed. Even if he's not armed now, if you reject him and he knows where you're staying, he can come and shoot you. Like this kind of violence. Yes, this is what they were like, okay, you just need, and we had to leave quickly. Like we had to leave quickly the place and just go somewhere else. So these are the kind of dynamics that when I think of like, what is it like, how much we were going by, just assuming we're all journalists, right? That's what we're all, you're a journalist, you're brilliant, you can navigate this, you can interview anybody, you're very outspoken and brave. That's all you needed to be. But then you reach and you realize like gender is a question. Again, like it's the question. You cannot escape that. You're not just a journalist. You are so many other things that people can pick on and use to violate you. So I think that I learned so much. Yeah.
So, guys, it's that time of the year where we're beginning to plan towards our next African Women in Media conference, which will be in Dakar, Senegal. The theme is media and sustainability. And we are approaching that from three perspectives. One, in terms of media business and financial models. Secondly, in terms of development goals. And finally, in terms of media ecologies, and particularly focus on artificial intelligence. And asking these questions about the industry, but also the voices and perspectives of women in these spaces. So I hope you join us in Dakar, where we'll have a range of panels and workshops and exhibitions. Usually our conferences are attended by people from all over the world. 75% of our attendees come from all over the world. So I look forward to seeing you guys on the 5th and 6th of December for AWIM 2024. And if you'd like to attend the conference, visit AWIM24. That's awim24.africanwomeninmedia.com. See you in Dakar. That's interesting. And so how did you go from there? Because that sounds like, I cannot even begin to picture your mindset and just being in that environment. How did you go on from there to go into African feminism and set that up and all of that area of work on women's rights?
Yeah, so for me, doing all that, actually, I think what galvanized me was when I finally decided to do my master's in media, peace, and conflict studies. Um, for the first time, because in the journalism school, they don't teach you anything about gender. It's only like, you treat people, include women, it's not depth, right? So for the first time, I was exposed to gender theories, understanding like the questions I always had, the discomforts, even not from journalism, from an early age as a girl, like things I would see in society, I'm like, but why, right? It was the first time, like, whoa, I'm not crazy, right? I'm not like an outlier. Someone has actually written about all this and it's here. And this is the time like the internet is becoming more available, cheaper for us to access and read. And it was my first time, trust me, to really be in a class and someone gives me the theories of gender as it pertains to conflict, pertains to how women are treated in society, how women and different people of different genders are classified historically. Just to take that class for me was one of the most eye-opening journeys. And I must say, like, I was very lucky to be taught by Mona El Tahawi, one of the most, forefront Egyptian feminists. And she had the fact that she had worked for agencies, I think Reuters and others, Guardian, in Egypt, Saudi Arabia, and had covered North Africa. She was teaching me and sharing, and she was teaching a class on Arab women and the media. It exposed for me like the genesis of media in the Arab world, which is very, very similar to experiences as an African woman, being taught by an Egyptian woman at an international level and exploring, layers of, colonization and patriarchy and understanding this from a woman, who has similar experiences of the same continent as me was very, very powerful. And seeing like the experiences were not that different, but also learning more about the genesis of like the Arab media and the emergence and where Arab women fitted in this grand, at the time, remember, we are in post, all this terrorism and terror war that America was fighting and everything. And the Arab world is really in a very big agitation moment, trying to fight back. So it was very, very, very important time for me to take that course, to understand. I remember us after school, after class, like chatting about her covering Muammar Gaddafi, literally.
Wow, really?
Being in Libya, and she shared this publicly, like literally. Muammar Gaddafi, because she was one of the probably the only woman or so as a journalist, Egyptian journalist, in the delegation of journalists having questions and people blocking her from actually accessing that, and God sexually harassing her. So we would then have these conversations that were very, very similar. Her having a history of coming from journalism and now teaching us and also introducing me to different lines of thought about feminism. It was very, very important grounding for me. It made sense to every questioning I'd had for me from my journalism experience and as a person. it made sense. So when I came back, actually after my course, because the university really allowed you to really do like a theoretical paper, or you could go to the field and gather, do a more research, So I opted to work with a women's rights NGO in Uganda, which was doing post-conflict work. So I needed to go back again to like the work I had worked on. And I could not believe the amount of like stories I was having access to now that I was working with an NGO, literally being there to do my kind of internship so that I can do my master's thesis from that. And I was having access to, they were having, for example, reproductive rights.
Yeah.
I had no understanding how prior really extent of what this means in a post-conflict society. And I was going with doctors doing open boot camps, like for the first time seeing upfront like the impact of the war on women's reproductive health. I remember, I think from one of the very big stories, I actually interviewed a woman who had come, and she had a relapse of the uterus, something like that. So where a condition where the uterus falls out of a woman because of, as a result of rape and violence that has impacted. And she had lived with this for years. Nobody, in the war, nobody's concerned about, they say war victims, rape victims. But these kind of services are unavailable for a long time. And I remember talking to her and seeing her get a surgery, right? And the fact that this was something that had crippled her entire existence, right? After that, you cannot go out, you cannot, your whole life is affected, and see that. So I was able to see this kind of interventions again from the other side of people who are doing interventions, post-conflict interventions, and what was working, what wasn't working. So I continued my work through that placement. And I think that's how I figured like I really need to build more on what I already learned. It's not just for peace and conflict, but really understanding the role of voice and dismantling all these hierarchies and violent structures that enable this kind of experience to happen. Because for me, then like mainstream journalism was very difficult for me now to reintegrate back. It was no longer easy for me to just interview a person and go. I needed to know what are the built mechanisms, what do we question, how do we connect this person's story every day, not just a story that I live. How do we reconnect this person's experience to the experience of many others, not just in that locality, but what's happening on the African continent? And I know as I traveled from different countries, for example, on the same role, I was able to go to Liberia and see the post-conflict issues there. I was interviewing refugees from Congo in Uganda. I was able to go to Bukavu and visit Dr. Mukwege's hospital, Panzi Hospital, doing incredible work. And for me, that was like, yeah, that has to be. It's not enough to just tell the story one day and move to another one. So it was for me difficult to really to work towards being back in the very mainstream media. So I had already by then, like even as a journalist, I had already started blogging. So I was already developing a whole different, as a new media, a lot of media houses were still like, really behind, not really realizing the importance of emerging technologies and what was going to happen. And because of the education and different courses I'd taken, I'd seen what people were doing in Egypt. This is post-revolution, and this is pre-revolution and post-revolution. And I was already talking to blogging communities, some mixed with journalists, activists, and I was belonging to other communities a whole lot together. So it's really grounded me in the idea that I think what then later journalism calls solution-based journalism, I see that emerging. But for me, it was not enough to say he, she said, and this. It wasn't. There was something missing in the very technical way journalism as imported from the Western world was approaching our questions. So I needed a different kind of approach. And that's how I grew in the blogging platforms, working with the writing at Global Voices, for example, the platform, very powerful, connecting different bloggers worldwide
Yeah.
and different activists, different issues. To belong there was for me to learn on the different emerging issues and the connections that was happening on the continent also. So
Mm.
that was a kind of,
This
before we come
journey.
to even African feminism, I was still like part of the blogging communities, pushing as we started. We were one of the first people on Twitter as Ugandans. I was I was responding to global campaigns like Kony 2012, with
Yeah.
all experience in northern Uganda, South Sudan, and Congo. I was responding to these kind of viral campaigns that were distorting the idea of what Africans needed. So I found that different, like channeling all this information I would build, like, so what was the question? What are you going to do about it? What are you
Mm.
going to use it for? Right. And that, so that's how I start, like, really being invested in the emerging digital world, and the way information was being kind of democratized, that you could actually have a voice quicker. Whereas in the newsroom, the equivalent of the voice in the newsroom is where you have like opinions pages
Yeah.
and columns. And those have always been dominant for me. They were men. Men of a certain age. You
Yes.
couldn't come up as a young person to have an opinion
An
in the very
opinion. Mhm.
traditional form of media, very patriarchal. So I had already begun that kind of resistance, having my own blog. When I did a story, I would actually go and put my own thoughts on that story. I would give
Mm.
you the story of how technically media wants this, but I would actually give my own comment of what actually could happen. What do I think? And it's not like all the time you're right, but those questions that linger, that you cannot
Mm.
carry into a story, I needed them to go somewhere. So as I was still in journalism, parallel, I was growing a community online, growing a platform, blogging on my platforms, and connecting with different platforms on African continent and worldwide. So that's how I think I was able to, like, to build then that voice, that then I kind of slowly find like communities of African feminists, and I'm like, okay, actually the bigger question is that you have all these questions, we know all this, but the traditional media is locked.
Yeah.
Even the women who are there, like, the space for change is still very difficult to navigate. So that's how I actually ended up in African feminism, and say, okay, the women know their story. They know what's going on. They can write about it. We can no longer rely on official status quo media to tell this story. Even oftentimes when they get it wrong, we can respond. We can show what the alternative voice look like, what people who are fighting for this think. Is very, very important. So that's how I really ended up in the feminism.
It's been really interesting hearing your journey and some of those experiences you shared, particularly, for example, in those conflict environments and that journey of setting up African feminism and all that, right? And I'm interested to know, like, what has inspired you along the way? Who are those people who have mentored you along the way, supported you along the way? What was the structure around you that enabled you to kind of do the things you were doing?
I'm a very structuralist person. If you know, like, I don't like structure, so I don't have a structure. I just follow my dreams. I just follow what calls me, and for me, the dedication to enhance knowledge among our people, for people to understand, for people to learn from our history, for
Mm,
to learn histories of marginalization and histories of triumph is very, very important for us to sustain our own selves today and building on the future. So for me, what sustains me is rooted in the need to see us advance and see us have better material conditions than
hmm.
what has been left for us, or what, all these systems have put us in. So for me, that will always be the goal, and journalism is just a vessel, or storytelling is a vessel. Ultimately, that's what it is.
Yeah.
And definitely, there's always been people I've looked up to, not from across that divide. women's rights, activists, people who were fighters, people who didn't have a place on the table, but they nevertheless came and fought and left something for us. For me, women in Uganda, when I look at women like Cecilia Ogwal, who just passed on, was a long-term member of parliament and leader, fearless leader. Those are the people I grew up looking up to and knowing that no matter what, I can do it, And of course, we always talked about the fact that you start from home. I've always had good examples of women, even when they didn't make it far, their resolve for me is what the lesson is. Their resolve, no matter what life has been, they've navigated it. My mother, my aunties, and not being bogged down necessarily by everything surrounding them, but struggling and trying to make it. So for me, it's very, very important to look. Most of the time, when I look at any people who have inspired me, was always women, and because that is the inherent experience of what I experience on the world. So I can't easily. I can find inspiration in other people, but ultimately making it in life is very personal. It's a personal journey. So you have to look really closely to those who share a similar journey as you are, as you even look up to those who might be different from you. I think in different newsrooms, I had many friends. Who are really well focused, a lot of really good friends, journalists, male and female, like, in equal measure, that are people whom I saw focused. And I was like, I want to be like that person, in terms of focus, in terms of knowing what I want to do. And that has been very, very helpful. But for me, usually it's always been like my dedication to, like, no matter where I am, no matter I change many newsrooms or I write for different people, it's always the reminder that, this is a journey and it's a struggle, and you're using journalism as a vessel, but also many people have experienced these kind of things as I already talked about how Mona Elta, how it really had a big impact on how I look at my deep understanding of gender and what it means in the world, what it means to be a woman in the media world, and what it means to be a woman in the media world, but also looking at women in general and understanding how to represent them and how to beat the long-standing stereotypes and barriers that have been put, because we don't live in a gender equal world. It's 100+ years away from us. So the struggle would always be there, and you have to look to those who are fighting like you, whether in other fields or in your own field.
And talking about gender and media, from your perspective and based on your kind of context, what to you is the if there was one thing that you think was a glaring gap in all of the activism around women's rights and gender equality in media, what would you say that was?
I think the enduring struggle is literally it's always patriarchy, and the fact that leadership, no matter where you are on this continent or over the world, it's deeply patriarchal. Even when you put women in charge, so people always say, we need more women. Yes, we do, because women have a right to be there as much as men. It shouldn't even be a question. But the question is that then what kind of politics do you espouse? It's deeply problematic that always sometimes when you push it, then the system that would rather have a woman who would represent women the same way that men have, right? But just put a woman there and say, oh, but we have women. They're making changes. This changing is hard, but it's not actually. When you agree that there's a system of marginalization, changing is not hard. Changing that is hard is change your mindset, your own mindset as a man leading these places, to understand that it's more than just adding women in newsrooms, but really deeply looking at the intersectional struggles of women and other people that have for a very long time been left out of not only newsrooms, but just basically society and public affairs, So you still have, for example, in Uganda, only 20% of the news sources being women, even when you have places that are run by women.
Yeah.
The news sources are not women. The news sources continue to be men. And there's always persistent excuses about, but women don't do this. Women
Mm,
are not available. But yes, if you understand the structure of your society and what needs to be done in order to make women available, the problem is to think that the marginalized people will be the only one to work towards equality, rather than looking at your position as someone, um, in charge of shaping opinion, shaping education of a country, shaping information, that you have to go an extra mile in order to bring the person who is not at the table. If women are going home, the unpaid care work is one of the biggest struggles for even journalists, even women journalists. The fact that you have to go and get a child from school, teach them homework, and do all these
hmm
things that oftentimes men don't do. So unpaid care work. So it not only affects the women in the newsroom, it affects the women that you're trying to make as news sources. So if you understand this, how do you work around them and the schedule? But to get them to understand that their voice is important. It's not that they don't want, it's just that they're burdened with so much care work already, that the availability that you have, easy availability of men cannot be the same as easy availability of women. And for me, that's always a persistent, the lack of understanding of entrenched systemic discrimination and oppression of women. If no
hmm
one understands that, then you make excuses for why women are not in the certain places.
hmm hmm
And also you don't put really long-term strategies to addressing those issues. You continue to blame that it's society that is like that.
hmm
And we know that it's not enough to just mirror society. I think it was the great Ken Sarua who said it's not enough for a journalist to mirror society. Your job is greater than that. You're not just say, oh, here they are saying this and that, and this is what they're. No, no, no. It's not like that.
Yeah,
We have
yeah.
a great responsibility as storytellers, as people in places of influence, to put a path to explain why things are the way they are. It's not enough to say this is what it is. So I think for me, it's what remains a problem.
Mm. And I guess much of what you're saying there really underlines the reason why we need to have equity. When we're talking about equality, it's not just equality and inclusion, it's also about equity. And that really, I mean, what you said really underlines the importance of that. And we spoke earlier on about kind of those who have inspired you towards where you are and your journey, and having that kind of, you know, those people around you and looking up to others. So for those young African women looking up to you, right, coming up behind you, following your footsteps, what's your advice to them?
Well, I would say that people are human and the journeys are quite unique. So do not be consumed by someone else's journey. And that's for me, I always have a very uncomfortable idea of a role model. I don't. I just see people, they inspire me towards something,
Mm,
and another one inspires me towards something. You can't find a person easily as a whole as an inspiration. Sometimes there are those parts of the person that will inspire you, and other parts require you to question. So find what inspires you about anybody's journey, or
mm,
seek out to people who have come before you to understand their struggles, their triumphs, and learn from them. But know that your journey is quite unique, as much as it is still very connected to other people. So
mm,
when you understand that, then you will know how to use, I think, the influence you've been given or where you found yourself, that you'll be able to connect the dots between yourself and the past, and then to be able to paint your own path,
mm.
and bring about changes that we have not been able to bring so far. And that's what we need. We need to see new people, new voices, new movers, for us to be able to shake the foundations of oppression, to be able to advance our societies. I think ultimately that's what the call is about.
Yeah, yeah. And I really love the way you framed that about like everybody is a whole, right? So that's which therefore means that there are aspects of them that you're gonna absolutely love and that's what is inspiring you. And then there's gonna be aspects that actually is not so great. And I think not expecting everybody to be perfect, this ideal role model is really important. And this really resonated with me because a few years ago I met with somebody that I've always observed from afar in the news and all those things, and just really inspired by all of the work she did. And I remember the very first time I met her and somebody introduced us, she pretty much blanked me. And I was so distraught. And I was so like, "What's this woman?" And she kind of like, when they just say hi and then walk away. And I really had to take a few steps back. I was like, "That's really." It was somebody I was really looking forward to meeting, somebody I'd looked up to, spoken about in spaces where she probably just never even knew that, she had somebody like me there. But actually, it took me a few days later. I just thought to myself, well, it was late in the evening. There was lots of people around there saying hello. She probably just had a very long, very hard day and was tired of all of the hellos. And she's only human, right?
Absolutely.
And actually, we run the risk of letting those kind of moments, overpower us and actually lose our dream or our inspiration because of that one tiny moment. But it's really important to understand that they're only human. And I've met her subsequently. We actually have each other's numbers now, and it's a completely different person to the person I met that night. But actually, I had to step back and remember she's just human.
Yeah, and usually people, because media is about image also, so
Mm,
people carry a certain image, but sometimes the image does not match the politics of the person, or
yeah.
sometimes the person is simply tired. And also, like, ask yourself, why are you putting people on a pedestal? Our job is to question power, and when every time you put someone on a certain pedestal, you are giving them power. So ask
Mm,
yourself, whom am I giving power, and for how much power, for what? Right?
yeah.
So if you finally meet the person, and then maybe they don't add up to what this image you have conjured in your head because of the space they occupy in the media industry or in
Mm,
society, then it's easier for you to walk back and say, oh, actually, yeah, it's totally possible that this can happen. And it's the
yeah.
same for me. It's a question of power and how you interact with power. And I think the job is for us to kind of shade that, ways in which African societies, but also hierarchical capitalist places, give
Mm,
power, hierarchical power, that then we tend to think that, oh my God, I want to be like that person. No, but you just be yourself.
yeah.
Maybe there are aspects of that person that inspire you, but don't aspire to be like somebody. Aspire to be yourself, because that person aspire to be themselves, and that's why you find them to be inspiring,
Mm,
and also know, like, media representation, sometimes sometimes a facade. So it's your responsibility to say, does the politics match the expectation, or it doesn't? But then you quickly gather yourself. Of course, we are not excusing that the need for people to be human and respectful. For me, ultimately a question of power, between whom you give that power, but also how power interacts with you. When that person knows they are powerful, then how do
yeah.
they interact with you? It's always something you always have to question, and that's the way you can unravel this idea of models and inspirations. Inspiration is very important, but you have your own path. Find the path. Use whatever you get. Find whoever is experienced, whoever is kind. Kindness is very
Mm,
important. Power is just fickle. It can disappear. Tomorrow. Indeed, people retire, people move, but find people who are kind, who are humble, not humbling, but not being humbled, but actually humility in a way that is a deeply respectful understanding of power,
mm.
and the need to be humane and relate to people in every way, in every opportunity you find.
Absolutely. So what next for you, Rosebell?
Wow, it's been a struggle, post COVID, and all this the media environment, the online environment being totally, unraveled. Right? We have
Mm,
seen media platform, we have seen the social media platforms. We've seen monopolies kind of congregate around social media platforms, where most of us are basing our informing people, where we are making communities, where we are sharing our stories. We found, especially for women and maybe queer people, for
mm,
minority people, the social terrain is becoming extremely violent, extremely exclusionary, because the kind of ownership that we are seeing in these platforms has zero care. They are interested in it's capitalist. They're interested in money and making profit over of rage. So where rage, there's no time to say, is this rage a good rage? Because there's good
mm,
rage which is changing things. in a place, but there's rage that is deployed to actually attack a certain section of society, take away certain rights of a certain section of society. And unfortunately, we see a lot of that kind of rough terrain for journalists. We see, hate speech, disinformation, gender disinformation. So I am working a lot on the nexus of that, looking at gender disinformation already, of all the barriers we've already seen of women and of coming to be storytellers, to be journalists, to successfully be able to tell these stories, but also the challenges are ever emerging and building on those existing challenges. So I'm very much interested, because having been online and most of my work being known mostly from online, although I worked in TV in Uganda, my work is mostly known online. So I'm interested in really how do we understand and study the emerging threats on journalists, female, women journalists, queer journalists, people who are marginalized doubly in society, so that we are able to respond. But at the heart of it is the capitalist kind of ownership of technologies and platforms that does not care about the lives of those on the margins. So I'm interested more in that kind of research, sharing and making sure that we can continue to push. I see myself as that kind of at that nexus of pushing and understanding these experiences, and then how do you push for change to have platforms or spaces, that public spaces, which I see social media as a public space, that we don't go backwards where women were said there's a meeting, you can't show up. That kind of thinking persists, right? Persists. So you find conversations online or the very platforms very misogynistic and pushing away a lot of women, while you're also having young and emerging platforms, but often like, how do you make them more protection of young people who are coming up, or on these platforms, because that's where the stories are being told, that's where information is and knowledges are being shared and produced. So it's very important that we protect, or we challenge those spaces and continue to support emerging and alternative spaces that can give us an idea, a healthy public discourse. For that's always going to be my dedication. What does a healthy public discourse look like for marginalized people, for women, socially? When we say marginalized, we don't mean in terms of like numbers. People tend to think numbers. We're talking about in terms of social, political, economic power, kind of marginalization, cultural marginalization. How does that healthy public discourse, participation and engagement, and getting whatever benefit you want to get out of it as that person work for you? How does that look like? And there are emerging challenges that I think that immense on especially highly visible female journalists and female, influencers and voices in our society. Thank you.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Rosebell. It's been such a pleasure hearing your story, your journey. You're an amazing person, and I know the things that you're involved in now is, I'm just wowed by it. So thank you so much for your time. It's been an absolute pleasure.
Thank you. It's been a lovely time, Yemi. Take
Take
care.
care.
Bye.
It's been an eye-opening conversation with Rosebell today, discovering firsthand what it's like to be a woman and a journalist covering war and conflict situations in any part of the world. And Rosebell's story clearly reveals the need to find and hold on to one's own voice amidst all the chaos and noise that comes with conflict. She also emphasized the need for journalists to not only mirror society, but to set a positive agenda using the enormous power we wield in society. Drop me an email at yemc@africanwomeninmedia.com with your thoughts, and please, if you'd like to be on an episode of Her Media Diary, let me know. To find out more about African Women in Media and our work, visit our main website, africanwomeninmedia.com. And in the show notes, there's a list of organizations and resources to support you if you have experienced any of the topics we have discussed today. And don't forget, join the conversation using the hashtag Her Media Diary.
Her Media Diary is a product of African Women in Media. an NGO advocating for gender equality in the media industry. And this episode was hosted by Dr. Yemisi Akimbobola, produced and edited by Blessing Udiobasi, as part of a 4-episode series on women in conflict reporting. All music featured in this podcast is by Nana Kwabena. Thanks for listening and join us again next time.